The latest assessment from the Director of National Intelligence anticipates the threat of disruptive technologies. It also finds that the COVID-19 pandemic will generate aftershocks for years. Pavel is Senior Vice President and Founding Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. Thanks for joining me. What struck you about this year's threat assessment?
Thank you for having me on here. What struck me was it was very good. It was very solid. It was very focused on the key near-term threats in a very prioritized and comprehensive fashion. It kind of flowed starting from China through the other nation-state challengers, Russia, Iran, North Korea, then talked about some of the transnational threats, terrorism, COVID, climate change, and then regional instability. So in some ways, it was sort of a primer on, okay, here's the exact threats that we're aware of, and it very much paralleled the president's initial interim national security strategic guidance. But I worried when I saw it that it was excellent as a 101, but unfortunately the world's more in 201, 301. And so how do we do a better job of thinking about the unexpected or the complex in the near term? There's a parallel document, the Global Trends 2040 document that was also released that was very good on long-term trends out to 2040. What are the big issues? It painted a very dark picture of things continuing to get worse, which I'm not averse to. But what I would have liked was a little bit of that in the first thing, because the world's spinning very fast.
Absolutely.
So even this year, we should expect something unexpected.
That seems like part of the challenge here, right? They're trying to give you the landscape of potential threats, but of course there are, they mentioned disruptive technologies that maybe they can't quite predict what those look like, or you have things like this pandemic that I think probably count as some sort of surprise. How can a document like this capture, things that might sort of lay ahead that are a little bit hard to pinpoint?
It's a great question, and especially for those of us who know the process, this is a coordinated, consensus intelligence community document, the first one, the annual. And so, maybe there's a section that is, labeled as more speculative, things we should think about. And so I think, putting it that way, using that to avoid strategic blind spots, using foresight so that policymakers can expand their imagination and say, okay, that is, even though that's not likely, that is possible, and we should think about how we do a better job of potentially preventing or mitigating if it happens.
I think that's an interesting idea of this as sort of a 101 document. How can it be sort of used as a tool maybe to enable, more sophisticated conversations about it?
I think, again, it's a great sort of set menu. If it's, I'll use an analogy. If you're going to a steak restaurant, I mean, it's served up steak. But, you might have a special on the menu that people might try. And here I'm talking about policymakers to say, I do want to dig a little deeper into that speculative thing. What if China's digital currency kind of comes back to bite us even starting later this year? What if an ally we were banking on to stay with us on a particular issue decides, no, we're going to hedge now that there's a little bit of relative decline between the U.S. and China in terms of overall power as China continues to rise? We're going to see some of this. We saw, for example, the UAE buy a lot of Chinese vaccines, even though they're less effective than the U.S. vaccines. That's just one example. What if Russia and China get much closer even than they already are? So these what ifs, I think, are really important for policymakers. You don't necessarily have to, develop a very big structured policy for all of the what ifs, and then, allocate your resources, your diplomatic, your economic, your defense resources accordingly. But it's, you want to put some of these things on people's minds so that when they see something happen in the world, that might trigger a thought that says, wow, that might lead to one of these what ifs.
Are you seeing that? Are you expecting to see Congress use this as perhaps a jumping off point for some more detailed discussions?
Well, certainly everything in the annual threat assessment, because it just covered everything that's currently on the horizon, it's almost every, major keyword is coming up in all of the testimony: China, Russia, North Korea, COVID, climate change. I mean, that's all coming up. So it is used, again, sort of as the baseline. This is what we have in front of us. But what I was suggesting was there are more nuanced discussions to have. What if some of these things combine even in ways that we didn't expect? And so that certainly should come out in testimony. It certainly should come out in additional statements from the administration and in readouts of U.S. consultations with its allies and partners. So the answer is yes, it's a good baseline. I'm not at all criticizing the annual threat assessment for being incomplete. It's not for not being well structured. It is very well structured. I'm just saying we might need a little more, because this is just a different era in history than even 10 years ago, even 20 years ago. We can all feel it. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of dynamism. China's moving very, very quickly. I think we underestimate the importance of speed in policymaking as one major point I would stress. And so we really need to, keep this kind of process and content very agile.
Thanks so much for joining me.
You're welcome. My pleasure.